I just wanted to start out by seeing if there were any questions or anything left over from last time. If not, just to remind us that there were, in the process of transitioning from Roman civic religion to Christianity, there were always sort of three social objections or political objections, if you will, to Christianity as a faith tradition. The first of which is that it took away that sense of allegiance to the civil government and the emperor as representatives of the divine in society. There was, that comment allegedly of Jesus about render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. That was a foreign notion to the Roman government. That was like a koan to them. It was a riddle. It was like, this doesn't make any sense. But it was a principle for Christianity. It's somewhat to Judaism, but Judaism had always aspired for the church to be the state, as opposed to the Roman view, which aspired for the state to be the church, basically. But Christianity was really willing to be a separate thing from the state, and that was kind of a new idea. There was also the sort of the QAnon conspiracy of the time, which was that these Christians had, scandalous rituals, and they were committing incest, and they were eating babies, and they were, all of those kinds of traditional accusations of people who are weird and we don't like them, and so we're going to have justifications for why we think that they should not be tolerated and why they're no good. And then the rejection of tradition, and I think you need to kind of have a sense, which we really don't in our culture, of how challenging it is in a culture that values things that are old, things that go back, from before anybody can remember, that makes them more true. It makes them more reliable. And I think about, like, in the Middle Ages, when you had your troubadours going around from castle to castle and entertaining people, they would never claim that they themselves had written or created a new song, because that would make it trivial. Nobody would want to listen to that. So what they would say is, oh, I learned a new song. I was in this other place, wherever, this other city or whatever, and I met this really old guy who taught me this song that goes way back to antiquity. I mean, that's how you would always introduce something that was new. Sort of like Peggy was talking about with the painters. It's not until almost the Renaissance that people start signing things because they're like taking credit for something. Well, the same thing was true in antiquity with philosophy or with religious ideas. You didn't want to say, I came up with this, because that made it way too temporal, way too human. You always wanted to say, this was revealed to me. I found this from an ancient source. But Christianity was, at that time, a very recent historical religion. And it's sort of like the contrast with Islam. Now, people look back and say, well, we know where Muhammad was born. We know that, this happened in Medina and this happened in Mecca. We know the years of that. So we know something. Or even more recently, Mormonism. We know where Joseph Smith was born. We know what happened in New York or in Missouri, or when they got to Salt Lake City. These things are a matter of historic record. It's harder to have mythology around them, so if you can take something back to the really ancient past, it has more authority. So Christians were giving their loyalty, their devotion to something that had been invented recently, as far as the rest of the Roman culture was concerned, and that was not a good thing in their eyes. And part of it was that if you didn't recognize the authority of antiquity, then you didn't recognize the authority of the existing social order, which meant you could be a revolutionary, you could be a disruptive force. And so a lot of people felt about Christians the way the conservatives felt about hippies back in the 60s, that this is just, it's challenging to the way in which things have always been done, and that is going to be destructive for the good order of society. So that for all of those reasons, Christianity is not a good thing. Now, I also wanted to say, as I've been going back over this, you can certainly identify, as I said last time, individual places and individual people that created persecutions of Christians in a particular town or a particular area, or you get some really crotchety local government official who really wanted to go out and round them up. The same thing happened to the Jews from time to time in a particular jurisdiction or whatever. But we have this image of the Romans feeding the Christians to the lions, right? I mean, like that, this was an ongoing huge phenomenon. And really, that's not very much the case. I mean, you really have to look hard to find particular instances of that. But what is going to be true is that when the Christians take over, they are going to persecute the pagans, but they are also going to write the histories. So there's a little bit of that, what I think of as sort of Trumpian projection, where the Christians are going to write about how they were persecuted as sort of a way of diminishing the persecution that they themselves are going to do. So I've sort of learned to read those stories about martyrdom as sort of, yeah, okay, this is what you say happened to you, and then what did you do to the people who disagreed with you? I think that's a question that always has to be asked. So that kind of brings us up to Constantine. Actually, if you look at the bottom of the page, I try to sort of line out some basic eras that we're looking at here. So there's what's kind of called the apostolic era, which is the time when the generation that actually knew Jesus was alive and active, which is pretty much between the time of his death until the destruction of the temple. Anyone who was an adult at the time of the death of Jesus was an old person by the time of the destruction of the temple, and then history changed at that point. So there's that very early era when you can't even really say that the Christian church existed. There were Christian ideas were circulating, Christian literature was being created. There were institutional struggles among the followers of Jesus, but it's hard to argue there even is such a thing as the Christian church until after the temple's destroyed. And then you have about 400 years then between the fall of the temple and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So there's this period of Christianity gathering itself together as a as a coherent institution. And of course, it doesn't start out that way, but once the Western Empire falls, once Rome is no longer a dominant political force, the church does kind of take over at that point as the thread of social order, and that's a shift. So that there's those 4 centuries there, and then you have about 1,000 years between when that happens and when Constantinople is conquered by the Ottoman Empire, which is in the 1400s. So that's a good chunk. And then within that, you also have what I think of as the growing challenge to Christianity, which really, I would say, begins with the First Crusade and the encounter with Islam and the beginning of resistance to the hegemony of the Christian church in Western Europe, and sort of comes fully to flower with Martin Luther in 1517 with his theses, and that the rise of Protestantism is sort of the end of that, the hegemony of Roman Catholic Christianity. So those are some eras to think of. And Constantine happens more or less in the middle of that. So you have about 200 years between the fall of the temple and the emergence of Constantine, a little more than 200 years. And then about another 200 years between when Constantine sort of takes the constraints off of the growth of the Christian church until the Roman Empire is over with in the West, and the church really kind of becomes the source of authority at that point. So does that make sense in terms of how to divide up your thinking about what time frame are we in here, right? Okay, so Constantine becomes emperor in 306. He's born in 272. He becomes emperor in 306. And he's a military guy. And it's hard to overestimate the importance of the military at this point in the history of the Roman Empire. They've become this huge colonial power. You know, they're trying to control the world from the British Isles basically to the borders of Russia, you know, and including Spain and North Africa in there, and the Near East as well. So it's this huge, very ungainly kind of universe to administer. It's the known world, as they will call it at the time, and it's you really cannot, if your model is that we Romans are going to be the central administrators of this entire operation, it's very challenging. It's like you've got to have both hands and both feet stretched as far as you can to try and control all this, because the people who you're trying to administer are forever trying to throw you out. And if you think about Jesus and his resistance to Rome, right? I mean, that's one of the things that's at the core of his whole message, is about how do we live in this culture that is at the mercy of this illegitimate power. And a lot of the areas that Rome was trying to control considered Rome to be an illegitimate power, right? They were colonial oppressors. And the further away from Rome you were, the more likely you were to be able to gather together your constituency and try and take them on. So like the Jews and the Palestinians are forever revolting against them. The Britons are forever revolting against them. everybody's always trying to get rid of them. So they depended on the army and military administrators mostly to try and keep things under control. And so your prestige and your likelihood of being elevated in the Roman hierarchy kind of depended on how good you were at keeping the peace and creating a flow of goods and services and taxes from whatever area you were administering. So people like Pontius Pilate, for instance, are always trying to tread carefully so they don't raise up resistance, but they also satisfy their superiors in Rome that they're getting what they need from them. So eventually, before Constantine, you have a couple of Roman emperors who say, look, this is just too hard. We need to divide up here. We need, one guy is going to be in charge of from Rome to the west, and another guy is going to be in charge of from Rome to the east, basically, is kind of how they looked at it. And by the way, we're even those two, they're going to have subordinates, so they're going to divide up even those areas. So they basically had 4 Caesars, 4 rulers, which is great in theory, but what immediately happened was each of those 4 people began trying to take over. So what it basically was a recipe for conflict at the highest level. At that point, that there was people were always going to be at war with each other, and that's what happened to Constantine. Constantine was a general. He was an heir to a Roman family that had was eligible, I guess you would say, to become part of the empire family of Caesars. But what you basically had to do was go out and be a general and prove yourself, demonstrate that you could lead the troops, that you could administer efficiently. And so what would happen would be, if you were out in the field at the time when the previous guy died, you might or might not get to become the successor. And that was based on basically 3 things. One is if the emperor who died, if the Caesar who died said, this is who my successor should be, that was a good thing. That was a nice credential to have in your pocket. But it wasn't necessarily determinative. I mean, it's kind of like if the American president today says, well, I can't run again, I'm termed out, but I endorse so-and-so. That's nice, that's great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to happen, right? The other thing was that could you physically get to Rome? Could you show up in the Senate and in the forum and say, here I am, I'm the new Caesar, I'm the new guy. So it was partly a question of logistics. So if you were a general who felt you were in contention, you wanted to be close by. If you thought that there was likely to be a transition of power, you wanted to be geographically close to Rome so that you could arrive there before your potential rivals. And then the third thing was, would your troops support you? So the first thing you wanted to do when you figured out that there was a power vacancy was you wanted to go to your army, your troops, and say, what do you guys think? How about me becoming emperor? And if they all cheered and said, yeah, we'll support you and we'll fight for you, then your chances were good. Again, not determinative. So if you could have all 3, if you could have the blessing of the last guy, and if your troops were behind you and you got there first, then you're in good shape. Then your chances for succession would be good. So Constantine had the endorsement of the previous Caesar, the previous emperor, and he had his troops behind him. He was apparently a competent general, so his troops were supporting him. So what he was trying to do is he was trying to get to Rome, right? So he could show up and be available to be recognized, shall we say, as the new Caesar. And this is what happened at the Milvian Bridge. That it was a bridge that he had to cross in order to get to Rome. And one of his rivals, who didn't want him to get to Rome, was on the other side of it. So he needed to get his troops across the bridge, and that was going to be a battle. You know, that was going to only happen with a military encounter. Now, Constantine was aware of Christianity, but he was originally a devotee of Sol Invictus. We talked about this last time, the unconquered sun, right? And Sol Invictus was one of a number of proposed sort of super deities, if you will, that where you, just because I'm a worshiper of Sol Invictus doesn't mean that I say that Isis doesn't exist or Poseidon doesn't exist or any of these other, they're all, that's fine, and they have their temples and we all worship them, and that's great. But as far as I'm concerned, Sol Invictus is the boss of everybody else. You know, I'm worshiping the head guy. I'm not going through channels, right? I'm going straight to the one who's in charge of the whole pantheon. That was what Constantine understood himself to be doing. So he has this interesting vision, and it's from looking into the sun. He has this vision when the sun strikes his eyes of this Chi-Rho sign, which is the two first letters of Christ, that it's used as an abbreviation. So in his mind, it's like, okay, Sol Invictus is telling him, here's who you want on your side for this battle, right? He's going to help you out in this particular crisis. So, as the legend says, he had all his soldiers paint these letters on their shields, and in fact, they got across the bridge, and he got to Rome, and he got to be recognized as the next emperor. So he succeeded. So at that point, he kind of he owed the Christian God, right? He owed this divine force that had helped him out. So what he did is he basically issued an edict that said, okay, everybody leave the Christians alone. Everybody quit doing these. If you had in mind a persecution, stop that. And besides that, give them back anything you took away from them the last time around. So, you know, if you took their church or if you took their money or whatever, give it back. And he didn't just say that about Christianity. He said it about other religious traditions too. So if you're oppressing the Jews, stop that. Whoever you're giving a hard time to, just cut it out. So what he does is decriminalize Christianity. He says that none of his administrators are supposed to bother people with minority religious convictions anymore, which is not a huge about face. You know, I mean, we've had other emperors before who said, you know, sort of leave everybody alone, let them do what they want. But at this point, there's enough interest in Christianity, and it's starting to emerge as a political institutional force that decriminalizing Christianity is significant. Because it's no longer just a bunch of ragtag hippies out in Haight-Ashbury Park. You know, I mean, they actually own property. They're actually prominent families that are starting to be part of this movement. So it's it does have consequences. It does have social implications. But it's not even saying at this point, by the way, I'm a Christian. That is not what he's saying in 313 in Milan. He's just saying to everybody cool their jets about different religious ideas. So the next thing that happens, and this is important for the history of the early church, it doesn't have that much to do with the Romans, but there is a big controversy in Christianity, and I think this is another place where we get this idea that it was all persecution all the time under the Romans, right? Because the next thing that happens is the Christians have a fight among themselves about, okay, now that we're saying, now that it's okay, it's cool to be Christian, how do we feel about the people who kind of cooperated with the Romans, who kind of conspired with the Romans, or who told us that we should go along with the Romans, who didn't hold out against the Romans? And in particular, how do we feel about religious leaders who did that? So there was this big push to say that anybody who was a priest or a deacon during the time of persecution and didn't stand fast, wasn't prepared to become a martyr, who said, oh, throw some incense on the altar for the emperor, it's not going to make that much difference. How should we deal with them? So there was one group that said, listen, everybody had to figure out what to do and make the best of it, and it's fine. And another group that said, no, these people have no more religious authority. We don't want to listen to them. We don't want them leading our rituals. We feel they should not have any authority. So if you were a bishop or a priest or even just a local deacon who was perceived as not having stood fast, then there was a group of people that wanted to sort of negate your standing within the community and say you were not a good priest, you were not a good Christian. And if the people that you had baptized during that time, their baptism was invalid. Okay, so if you were an unfaithful priest or an unfaithful leader during that time, or an unfaithful bishop, even worse, then the people that you had ordained and the people that you had baptized, all of a sudden they were out. It's like if you married someone, suddenly they weren't married anymore, that kind of thing. And it's called the Donatist controversy. And the ultimate decision was, no, once you're baptized, you're baptized. And it doesn't matter if it later turns out that the priest who baptized you was a no-good Nick. If you were married, you're married. And it doesn't matter if the priest who married you is, guilty of misconduct or whatever you want to say. So that it's interesting that as soon as the pressure of the not being quite legitimate, not being quite acceptable within the overall empire, as soon as that's relieved a little bit, what do? They turn and fight with each other, right? And what that's really about is who's going to be in charge, right? And who's going to determine what makes you a good Christian. So you can kind of see it as the next generation. Paul's no longer around. We're no longer having the fight about what about eating meat that was sacrificed to idols? What about, do you have to be circumcised? We've kind of settled that. No, you don't have to be circumcised. We know that now. Now we're going to have this fight about how faithful do you have to have been? How willing do you have to have been a martyr? What counts as having been loyal to the brotherhood, sort of during this time of difficulty. Does that make sense? Anybody have questions or comments at the moment? Okay, so the next thing that supposedly happens, and it doesn't actually, but this is when it is supposedly dates from, is what's called the donation of Constantine. And this is where I want to, let's see if I can do this. Share the screen and, hang on. Here we go. Can you see that? You guys are all muted. Give me a thumbs up or something.
Yes,
Has it?
I can see it. I can see it.
Okay, great. All right. So this is Constantine the emperor there, with the Bishop of Rome at that time. And he is giving this authority, it's the bishop's hat. He's handing the bishop the hat. And basically saying that after his death, the civil authority over Rome itself and the Roman Empire is going to this Bishop of Rome. So he's unifying, allegedly, the civil and the religious authorities, putting them back together, no longer in a pagan context, but now in a Christian context. But he's taking that, the way that it was back in the days of pagan Rome, where the civic and the religious were kind of all one thing, and he's doing that again. And one of the things I think is really interesting, if you see that weird little umbrella that the guy is holding in the background, that umbrella is still there in any church that is a basilica. And the basilica is the seat of a bishop. So I remember this from the Basilica of St. Mary in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. You get this weird, funny ceremonial umbrella, and that it goes all the way back to these early days when that was a symbol of a bishop. So we're going to come to find out, and this I believe is a 13th century mosaic, because we're going to come to find out that this is a forgery. The donation is a forgery. That idea is never actually happened. But this is when they said it happened, right at this time when Constantine removes the penalties for being Christian. The church is going to later look back and say, oh, that must have been when he said that the religious authorities would also be the civil authorities. So I'm sure, Peggy, that all of those figures that are sort of up in the castle at the top, I think those have to be portraits of folks, I mean, that it's like, who was there when this supposedly happened? I'm sure if we did the research, we'd find out that all those people are supposed to be witnesses to this,
that makes sense.
Event, because they have very distinctive, faces and hair and everything.
I'm looking at the guy on horseback under the arch.
Uh-huh.
The horse that's floating about 3 feet up.
I know, isn't that weird?
Even in medieval art, that's not normal.
Yeah, right. Right. Yep.
What'd you say the date on this was?
I think it's either 12th or 13th century, the mosaic itself.
Yeah.
Because that's when they really got interested in whether this had actually happened.
And I noticed the horse has stirrups, which dates it too. Yeah. So it has to be at least 12th century.
Right. And this is how they're going to prove ultimately that the alleged document is a forgery, because it uses literary terms that would not have existed at the time. But that's not a concept that the church had before the beginning of the Renaissance.
A question. One of those guys, like in the back up there, it looks like he's holding a crown. Is that do you know what that?
I don't, but I have a guess. My guess is that that is the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor that is going to come to be. And who knows, maybe that's Charlemagne coming in on the horse. I don't know. Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, somebody probably does. I just haven't done the research, but I thought it was a fascinating sort of retrospective image of what they thought that might have been like, you know, when Constantine did that.
Kendall, I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you saying then that the church did take that authority?
Yes.
And claimed that this had happened?
Well, right. They tried to. I'm not sure they were ever totally successful. And part of what we're going to see. I mean, this is why it becomes important. It's why they're going to, in the 9th century, starting in the 9th century, they're going to look backwards and they're going to look for some justification for saying that the church, the authority of the church is superior to the civil authority. They're going to want to be able to justify that. And that, you know, this is that same principle. If you can prove that it's really old, if you can prove that it happened way back, then that makes it more real than if it's something that we just made up recently, right?
The Christian church abandoned the idea of separation of church and state completely then.
Oh, right. Well, they never wanted, they were perfectly happy for the church and state to be conflated as long as the church was in charge.
As long as they were the church.
Right. Yeah, right. Exactly. And this, I mean, this is true even up to the Unitarians in New England. You know, they were in favor of a state church until they realized they were in the minority, and then they changed their minds. So yeah, the church is always going to argue that this is the way God intended for it to be, right? But if they can argue that there is historical precedent for it, that makes it more persuasive to more people. Because anybody can make up whatever they want about what God thinks, but you know, history's history, maybe.
Right, tying it to that lineage, and that's why Charlemagne, when he was crowned by the Pope, he chose the Pope to crown him.
Right.
Which identifies the Pope as being more powerful but aligned with. And then the Pope says, you are the rightful heir to Constantine.
Right.
And then that connects that lineage and makes it so
How do you argue with that? Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh, you know, I mean, that's another possibility, that all those guys up in the top there are popes. Or they also might be, there's 5 of them. So they might be the bishops of the 5 C's that we're going to talk about in a moment too. So, you know.
And that's why, so like Napoleon, when he was crowned, the Pope was there, but he took the crown from the Pope and put it on his own head.
Right. As saying the Pope doesn't have the authority to do this, I'm doing this, but the Pope is here, so therefore the church thinks it's okay.
Right.
You know, so it's very, you know, exactly how these things are imagined tells you something about the power dynamics that are in play in that moment. So I just thought that was a fun image. Go back. Okay. Let me get back to where I can see all of y'all. There we go. Okay. So that, just keep in mind, it didn't actually happen, but that's when it would have happened. That's when they imagined that it happened. What did happen was that in 325, Constantine got fed up with the controversies in the church, like the Donatist controversy. I mean, it's like people were denouncing each other and excommunicating each other and saying, you know, don't listen to that guy. He cooperated with the governor when he was, you know, throwing Christians to the lions and so on and so forth. And Constantine was a competent, but maybe not imaginative administrator. So he wanted this settled. You know, he wanted people, the Christians, to get their act together and tell him who was in charge and what it meant to be a Christian. So that's where we get the Council of Nicaea in 325. And it actually, Constantine started getting antsy about this a while before that. I think it's like 320 or something. He starts trying to get something like this to happen. But it took a long time back in those days to say, okay, we're going to have a conference and it's going to be here. And here are the people who are invited. And here's when it's going to be. So everybody, you know, get on a ship, you know, and get here. And as you can imagine, I mean, people dropped dead before they could get there, and messages didn't arrive. And so it was a terribly complex thing to actually try to bring together the leaders of the various different factions in the church in one place. And also it meant that then those people were away from the places that they were supposed to be in charge of. So someone else was in charge while they were gone. And of course, the way travel was, it took a long time for some of them to get from, you know, Alexandria or wherever they were to Nicaea. And then they were there for months. So it was a huge undertaking to make this happen. So the preparation started well before actually 325 to get it together. So after 325, you don't see Constantine on his coins or other representations of himself with the image of Sol Invictus. So my interpretation is that part of what came out of that council was Constantine himself getting the message that you've got to choose up sides here, and you've got to decide whether you're going to represent yourself as a Christian or whether you're going to represent yourself as a Roman pagan who thinks Christians are okay. And so he drops that Sol Invictus imagery as of that point. Two other things that he wanted. I mean, we think of Nicaea as being about the Arian versus the Athanasian, or the Unitarian versus the Trinitarian controversy, and that's very true. There were a lot of people arguing that Jesus was kind of special, but not God himself, and other people arguing that Jesus was human, or else what's the point? And then there was a group of people saying, no, Jesus is God. That's what Paul was saying, and the system doesn't work otherwise. So that was part of what they hashed out, although Constantine himself, and we know this about his closest Christian advisor, if you will, his confessor, they were both Arians. They were both Unitarians, and so is his son. And so there's a sense in which he himself, Constantine, kind of was on the Arian or Unitarian side, although the council came down on the side of the Trinity, which is why we have the Nicene Creed. That goes all the way back to that event where it says, you know, I believe in, you know, God the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and you know, tries to articulate that idea of the Trinity in sort of no uncertain terms. So the council actually sided with Athanasius, and they exiled Arius. They sent him away to no longer be in power. But not that long later, Constantine kind of calls him back and he actually sends Athanasius into exile. But then after Constantine dies, the church authorities kind of come back around to the Nicene Creed and the Athanasian solution. So it doesn't last. But even in that thing which we tend to think was settled in the council, it wasn't really settled by the council. It continued to be a controversy until a number of years later. The other thing that the Nicene Council was required to do was to figure out who's in charge. And that was something that Constantine really wanted to know. He's like, okay, I'm the emperor. I understand who's in charge of civil authority. I haven't got a clue who's supposed to be in charge of this whole religious thing. And the reality was that the Christians didn't have a clue who was in charge. They basically had prominent churches. You know, today we'd call them tall steeple churches. They had like, in Kansas City, it would be the Church of the Resurrection, right? Sort of what's the most popular, richest, most politically influential Christian outfit in your town. And that's who represents your town. And so that's who we're going to listen to, right? When you send a letter to everybody saying, here's what, Alexandria thinks about this, that's who we're going to listen to as a representative. But there were a bunch of them. I mean, there's all kinds of Christian churches. And so who has enough clout to make their interpretation stick, right? That's sort of the question. And so what happens at Nicaea is they say, okay, we have 5 jurisdictions. We have 5 areas where the people who are in charge of those areas, the bishops of those 5 areas, they get together, and the 5 of them are more or less equal to each other, and they're in charge. That's the answer that comes out of Nicaea. And part with a sort of side comment of, but the Bishop of Rome is really in charge of them all. So there's this sense of, okay, Rome is the first among equals, but really, for all intents and purposes, Rome is in charge, which is partly okay with Constantine because he's in charge of Rome. That's the locus of the civil authority anyway. So it makes sense. But I want us to be aware of these 5 C's, or what's called the pentarchy. That's where that word comes from. The rule of the 5, basically, is what that word means. And there's a reason for the presence of each of these cities as being a center within the church. So I'm thinking let's take a few minutes break right there, and then we'll come back and talk about where these 5 areas are and why they're important. So.
Oh, Peggy, was it raised by wolves?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm usually anti science fiction, but that sounds interesting.
This is different. It's philosophical. It deals with artificial intelligence, and it deals with, you know, what is a religion. You know, the one group thinks they're completely the atheists, and the other group that worships the sun are religion. But then they explain, well, life really is dependent on the sun, you know, I mean, but that's science. Now, it's really interesting. And I suggest listening to the podcast. Look up the podcast, same name, because that's where they get experts to discuss not the science of it, and the idea of artificial intelligence and emotions and religions. And like I said, one of them is totally on Mithraism, and so raises lots of questions. I think a lot of people are going to be talking about this for a while. Ooh, maps.
Yeah, okay.
I like
good.
maps.
All right, wait. All right. I need to move you guys over there. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So Constantine was in Rome, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, once he was in charge, he was, yes.
Okay, and the Council of Nicaea, I looked up Nicaea, but that's in what is now Turkey.
Yeah.
So
why
was that?
Well, because Constantine is going to build himself a city here, right around the time of the council. He starts Constantinople in 324. It's not actually finished until about 330. But he's going to move his capital, and this is why you have the map, because you can see here's Constantinople over here, and basically these are the 5 sees. These are the 5 bishops who are supposedly together in charge of things. So you have the Bishop of Rome. That's not hard to figure out. He's the person who's up close and personal at the capital of the civil empire there. You have the Bishop of Jerusalem, and you can kind of understand from a historical viewpoint why the head guy in the city of Jerusalem would be considered important, because that's where the whole Christian thing gets started, right? But they're not as influential because the church isn't as big as the other 4. So Jerusalem is kind of there, I say, by historical courtesy. Basically, it's you don't want to exclude them, but they're really not where the power is anymore. But the history is, and part of the claim of each of these sees, of each of these cities, is to a certain kind of historical significance. And so, you know, if you're going to talk about historical significance, Jerusalem has a pretty good claim to be more important than anybody else, right? So you've got to include them. But as you can see, in this map, by the way, is from around 1000. It's after the establishment of Islam, so it's kind of showing you where the areas where Islam has an impact. So don't worry about that. But it lets you see very clearly where the pentarchy is located, and it's sort of like an upside down Nike swoosh there around the Mediterranean. And that's Antioch. You can take the IA off the end. They're the middle one. So you've got Rome, you've got Jerusalem, and then the next oldest one, as you might imagine, is Alexandria, because Alexandria is founded by who? do we think?
Xander.
Alexander, right. And it is, you can kind of see there, it's at the mouth of the Nile, where the Nile meets the Mediterranean. And it's founded near one of the port cities of the Egyptian culture. But Alexander, of course, wanted to build his own city with his own monumental architecture and his own stuff. And they do manage to get his body when he dies. So his tomb is there for at least several centuries, and then we're not sure what happened to it. But so it is founded in 331 before the Common Era, during Alexander's conquest, if you will. And it has, partly because of being a business hub, if you will, it has the largest community of expatriate Jews of any other city in the classic world. So that's where the scholars who first put together the Pentateuch, who codify the Hebrew scriptures, are working in Alexandria. Once the temple's destroyed, in some ways, Alexandria becomes a center of Jewish scholarship, as well as secular scholarship. I mean, it has obviously a very famous library, and it inherits some of the prestige of Egypt as being the oldest culture. Everybody knows that Egypt is older than everything else, right? So there's some sense that anything that happens in Egypt must be older and wiser and more intellectually prestigious, if you will. So, and it's the southmost of these Christian communities. So anywhere that there is a significant Jewish community, there's going to be a significant Christian community, because that the first impulse of Christianity is always going to come out of members of the Jewish community who decide to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, right? So, and there are apostles to Alexandria from, people go from Jerusalem to Alexandria, but it's not Paul. So you think of Pauline Christianity as going from Jerusalem up through Antioch and over to eventually Rome, but it never goes in the southwest direction. Does that make sense? So other people are bringing Christianity to the Egyptian, the North African area there. That makes sense? But it's a city that's only about 400 years old during the apostolic age. Antioch is around about the same time. It's established by one of Alexander's generals after his death. The general himself is not named Antiochus, but both his father and his son are. So obviously you like the name. So he names the city that he's going to found as sort of the capital of the Seleucid Empire, the Greek successors to Alexander, who are going to try and hold Alexander's conquest together. And this city is founded very near what was kind of a crossroads for the trading with the Far East. So it's a center of the spice trade. It's one of the endpoints of the Silk Road. And the Jewish community that settles there is granted full Roman citizenship, or it'll become full Roman citizenship, but they're granted full free Greek citizenship when they settle there, which is not true in Alexandria. It's not true in some of the other cities that had expatriate Jewish communities. So Antioch becomes the second largest expatriate Jewish community, where the Jews have significant power because they're not second-class citizens in this location. And many of the original Jews who settle in Antioch are themselves or descendants of mercenary soldiers, Jews who joined the forces of Alexander or his subsequent successor generals because they wanted to see the world, or because the pay was good, or because they wanted out of the intense Jewish culture of Jerusalem. Who knows why? But anyway, so some of them, a significant number of them, go to Antioch and settle there and become prominent, and therefore that is kind of the place that Paul is headquartered. To the extent that he had a headquarters at all, the place that he went back to was Antioch, and it was from Antioch that he would go back to Jerusalem, the 2 times that he actually went to Jerusalem to confer with the church there. You can see how he would have traveled the opposite way from where he normally went, which is up through Turkey, through what will be Constantinople, and over toward Rome. Does that make sense? Okay, and then the latest or most recent city is Constantinople, which is founded, of course, by Constantine, right? Because he wants if you look at the area that Rome is trying to control, which comes all the way over to Egypt and Alexandria, Rome is not particularly well located to be in charge of this whole western area, right? You can see how you get to Rome, from Rome up to the British Isles, more easily than you get from Rome to, say, Jerusalem, right? So Constantine is thinking, we need a more centrally located capital, right? So he is going to come over to the kingdom, or the area that's known as Byzantium, and there actually is a city that was the center of Byzantium that was known as that, and he built his own city, again, interested in sort of monumental architecture, but it's basically in the same area as the city of Byzantium. So he's the thing that he liked about the idea of starting over by 324 is that he also wanted to build a capital city that had no existing temples to the Roman or Greek gods. So he's able to build this new capital city with only Christian churches within the city walls. So that's part of the feature for him when he starts Constantinople, is that he's now going to have a capital city where it's going to be Christian, and he's kind of in control of the Christians. So he's not going to have any political competition from, the temple to Zeus, or the temple to Artemis, or the temple to anybody else. It's kind of like, if you remember, when Akhenaten moves the capital of Egypt out of Thebes, because he wants to get away from where the opposition controls everything. Constantine is doing the same thing when he founds Constantinople. So its church, its Christian community is kind of has special status, if you will. It's easier to be a Christian in Constantinople than almost anywhere else in the empire. and therefore the church is going to flourish, and therefore it's going to be prominent. And eventually what's going to happen is when the empire splits, and you can kind of see the difference between the pink and the green there. When the Roman Empire breaks in half in the 11th century, Rome is going to be the capital of the western portion, and Constantinople is going to be the capital of the eastern portion, right? I mean, you can see how that works. But at the point that Constantine is doing this, he believes that he's moving the capital to the more central point in the totality of the empire. Now, each of these cities has one or more traditional apostles that are at this point traditionally came there to bring the gospel and found churches, and usually also the legend is that they were martyred there. So each of them reaches back into that apostolic age to say, okay, well, we know that both Peter and Paul were in Antioch, and we know that so-and-so was in Alexandria. I'd have to look him up, but so there's both a claim from present power and prestige within the organization, but also a claim to antiquity, that we have we have prestigious apostles who founded the church here, that we go back that far. So what comes out of the Council of Nicaea is that these 5 areas are going to be the way in which Christianity is kind of going to be divided up, and those 5 bishops need to fight it out among themselves. When questions of doctrine or practice are going to come up, that's who's going to make those decisions theoretically. So that's the best answer Constantine could get out of the council of who do I talk to? Who's my guy? Who do I call up? So at that point, because he's moving the capital to Constantinople, the bishop of Constantinople also begins to feel like, well, I'm the guy who's located in the capital city, so I should actually have more clout than the guy in Rome, because, yeah, it used to be there, but it's not there anymore. So the primary competition is going to end up being between Rome and Constantinople, and that is going to be part of what leads ultimately to the division of the churches as well as the empires, the administrative districts. So I hope that map is helpful in terms of conceptualizing, what's going on here. And I can. So I make it go away, or are you still looking at it?
We're still looking. Oh.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll go back. See, Peggy's had more practice at this than me. There we go. So that's everything that I was going to kind of mention today. Are there questions or thoughts about how this is working? And keep in mind that we do not yet have, although we will soon have, Athanasius is going to write his, I think it's his Easter letter. Hang on, let me find this. In 367, which is 30 years after the death of Constantine. Athanasius, the bishop, same guy who was arguing for the Trinity, is going to send out a letter, and this is how they did a lot of their politicking. They would send out a letter, much like Paul did, to all the churches. And in this Easter letter, Athanasius lists what he considers to be the canonical documents, the actual scriptures of the Christian faith. Different people had suggested sort of different lists, but this letter in 367 is the first delineation of the actual contents of the New Testament that we have now. So it's not until 367 that you get somebody saying, all right, here's my list. And that turns out to be the list that becomes authoritative, that establishes the content of which letters of Paul are going to be in, which gospels are going to be in, the fact that the Revelation is going to be included, the fact that some of the other gospels are going to be excluded, the Shepherd of Hermas is going to be excluded. There's some things that were strong candidates that didn't make Athanasius's list. And I don't necessarily think it was that he had the power to make it so much as that people saw his list. It got a lot of publicity and they said, okay, that's good. You know, let's go with that. That one makes sense. And so it came to be sort of commonly accepted. But it won't be, what should I say? It'll still be flexible actually until the late 1400s, when the invention of the printing press. Once you get the printing press going, then everybody has the same thing. But you know, for that 1,000 years in there, part of it was, well, what do you have a copy of? You know, and you start getting monasteries and monks who are making copies of things that then become authoritative because they're being copied. You know, it's still a fairly emergent process, if you will.
But really, till the printing press, though, they were rarely put together. I mean, it
Right.
wasn't an issue. They were all just separate books anyway.
Right. That's right. And you can understand why, because there's only so small that you can write as a scribe.
Oh, right. It took
And
years.
so, you know, if you look at your New Testament, I mean, you practically need a magnifying glass, right? We found that when we were doing the scriptures to actually read. And a lot of times, in order to get a Bible, you know, that's actually portable, the paper's like tissue thin, right, that it's printed on. And so if you don't have that, if you're actually printing on vellum, which is a fairly hefty kind of thing, and you're writing in, you know, even if you're a very practiced scribe, you know, there's a limit, given the nature of ink and the nature of a quill pen, there's a limit to how small you can write. These were big books, right? And to put them all together and bind them in one volume, very seldom happened, actually. And you can get, I mean, what you often got was the 4 Gospels. You know, those you can put into one volume and have them all together. And then you get, you might have Revelation by itself, and you might have some letters of Paul and some other letters of Paul or something like that.
The Psalters were very popular. So were books of Genesis. Those
Right.
were popular.
Exactly. Because, you know, I mean, copying out all that stuff about who begat whom and how many jewels there should be on the priest's breastplate and all that. I mean, a lot of effort went into copying something that a lot of people didn't care that much about. So it was much more common to copy the things that people more wanted their own copies of. Or, you know, if you had if someone was building a new church, first of all, you had to find a relic, and then you had to find some scriptures, right? And so one of the things that you could do was to sponsor the copying of some portion of the scriptures for that new church, that if that made up for a sin, or it fulfilled a vow that you'd made, if if your voyage was successful, or if you lived through the plague or whatever, you could go to the local church and say, okay, I'm going to sponsor the copying of certain part of scriptures. And but they were very valuable, and they were very flexible. Somebody would say, well, okay, how much do you want to give? Okay, I want to give $500. All right, well, that'll pay for the Gospels, or that'll pay for like the Psalms or something. And you'd say, okay, well, then just copy that, right? And not that many people could afford to say, copy the whole thing. And it was hard to know what the whole thing was anyway. So again, and that didn't happen until after Constantine was dead. So Constantine would have loved to have had someone say, here's what's in the scriptures. But it wasn't clear until after he was gone, and for a fairly long time after that, actually. Okay, back to you all. Come on. Sorry, am I? There, okay.
We are.
There we are. Okay.
In the hang of it.
Yeah. We have a few more minutes if anyone has
I have a question about
yeah.
that. I've heard of the Holy See. I never knew what it meant, but I've heard of it. So is that still a thing? Are these 5 places still sort of important? Or?
Historically, yes, but it currently, no. Because if you think about the map, the Muslims took over Alexandria and Jerusalem, and ultimately Constantinople and Antioch too. So they became less authoritative for the Christian tradition at that point. So that really only leaves Rome.
I think I've heard of it somehow in the context of like when they were choosing a new pope or something. And I remember hearing some reference to the Holy See, but I didn't know.
Well, see, at this point, I think in general, when someone talks about the Holy See, they're talking about Rome.
Okay, so they just mean Rome when they say the Holy
Right.
See. Okay.
But it is still true that the technical term for the area that a bishop oversees is a see.
Okay.
And that those terms literally are related. The bishop's see is what he oversees.
Okay. I never made that connection.
Oh, okay.
But what happened was the Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, became the Pope, and that for several centuries anyway, allegedly settled the question of who's in charge. Because especially once the Muslims took over, it was hard to argue that the Bishop of Alexandria had anything to say about anything. He had no political power, so he sort of dropped out of the equation. But then you start having, as Christianity becomes more politically significant throughout the rest of Western Europe, then there are sees in Spain and sees in France and sees in other Western European areas. But I think I'll have to look that up. But I think the Holy See means Rome, because they're in charge.
Okay.
But especially once there's the Muslim conquest, and then there's the split between the Western and the Eastern Catholic traditions. So between those two, although they, for instance, they retained the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople, each felt that they had retained the right to excommunicate the other, right? So,
Of course. This may be a stupid question, but which is higher, a bishop or a cardinal?
a cardinal.
So there
is
were
more-
no cardinals at this time.
No, that is a more recent term, and that's a great question. I'll have to figure out when did they start having cardinals?
Yeah.
For their archbishops.
Well, archbishop, actually the sees, these 5 sees, that begins the idea of the archbishop, because within the sees there are in fact some other cities that have a head guy who thinks he's a bishop. And so they started calling, okay, these 5 are archbishops, because they have authority even over these other bishops of these other cities. So I think the archbishop comes before the cardinal. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
It's going back to that mosaic.
Yeah.
So now that object that was being was that like a bishop or a mitre or a headpiece?
Yeah, the bishop's mitre, exactly.
Okay. Okay. That's just,
Yep.
wasn't sure about that.
Yeah, that's a very ancient indication, just like the little umbrella thing.
And the throne he was on. I mean, he was seated on a cathedra.
Yes, right, exactly. Well, I think the bishop was standing up, wasn't he? It wasn't it
I thought that was
Constantine?
the bishop I thought that was bishop on the throne.
Let
His
me
bishops are-
see if I can get that back. Wait a minute.
That wouldn't, I mean, he was wearing some sort of mitre already, the guy.
Yeah, yeah.
That had to be the bishop.
Hang on.
You couldn't tell from the object who was handing it to who. So I just made the assumption that that was the bishop on the throne, because cathedral means the seat or throne of a bishop, and there's
Yeah, no,
symbols.
I think that's Constantine on the throne. Let me try
Huh.
one more time.
That changes the whole meaning.
Share screen. There you go. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, this is Constantine over here with the white crown.
Yeah.
But he's blessing the other guy. Wouldn't the bishop be blessing?
Well, I thought it was Constantine giving the hat to the guy with no hat, who would have been the Bishop of Rome. And with that, he's conferring the civil power. Because see, the whole point of this is that bishops are not yet civil authorities. The whole point of this this proposed historical act is that Constantine is using his authority as emperor to endow the bishops with civil authority.
You can't really tell who's handing that to who from their hands, but you've got the religious official behind him with a cross. He has a halo behind his head. He's dressed like a bishop in religious garb, and he's wearing a double mitre. I still think that's the bishop on the throne.
And Constantine's the guy with the fancy clothes.
Right. And he's just,
Huh.
but you can't, it's hard to tell.
All right, I'll have to look that up. That could be, but see, we're so used to thinking of the church as the highest authority. Because see, the other thing is Constantine becomes a saint, right? So I'm thinking maybe he gets the halo because he's going to be a saint.
He's not a saint yet.
Yeah, but that never bothered him, right?
It's
I mean,
all-
they put halos on anybody who was going to be a saint, didn't they? Whereas I don't think the Bishop of Rome ever was thought of as a saint.
Yeah,
But I don't know. I mean,
it's hard to.
right. And I still want to know who the guy on the floating horse is.
Yeah, he seems like he must be somebody of importance.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
I will look this up and see if we can
hard to
decode this a
decipher.
little more.
Yeah, it's really hard to decipher
Yeah,
these old things.
right. And you know, somebody somewhere knows. So
And one of them's much older. I mean, the guy with
yeah,
the
right.
kind of red hair is much younger.
Clearly, yeah, he doesn't have the beard or the white hair. Yeah, right.
So it's hard to know.
Yeah.
Like, I think of a bishop as being an older person or someone who's, which is not necessarily true at all,
No, not at all.
because I can name people who were
Mhm.
bishops at the age of 17.
Sure. Right.
Uh,
Right. um. Okay. Well, I will see what
Yeah,
I can
no.
find out about this, and we will revisit it next week. I also want to know who, now that I'm looking at it carefully, I want to know who those guys in the upper right
Yeah.
are. So,
And one of them one's holding a crown. It looks like one's
Yeah.
holding a book.
book. Yeah.
Well, that could be significant too.
Right. You know, if there was only 4 of them, I would think they were the apostles.
Yeah.
But because there's 5, I'm wondering whether they are representatives of the 5 C's. And because this is
Oh.
all about the bishops and,
Hmm.
you know, what their powers are and so on. But it does look like the guy in the center is more secular dressed, and the guy on the throne is more clerical.
Yeah, well, that thing, at first I thought that was his white hair hanging down the back, but now I think it's part of the
Oh, it's the
mitre
tabs.
thing on his head, and
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
thing hanging down the back.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he looks like the guy on the last guy of the 5 on the right. Looks like
Yeah.
the throne. So I wonder if that's a duplication, and these would be the 5 C's.
Oh,
Hmm.
that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. But then the guy with the crown kind of looks like the guy in the fancy clothes too. So
We can't know. There are too many possibilities.
yeah.
That could be just some regional idea or some contemporary
Right.
thing that just happened, and these are local officials that get painted in.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
there's a million things it could be that
Right.
we really have no way of ever knowing.
That's, you know, and there's always spin going on, you know, like you
Exactly.
said. There's
They're political.
somebody's arguing for something. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
I wonder
we'll
what
stay tuned.
city that's supposed to be. Is that supposed to be Rome or Constantinople?
I wonder if it's not Constantinople. That could be. I will find out. We will come back.
Good luck, because that's going to be hard to do.
Yeah, well, I will make an effort to find out. Let me put it that way. All right.
Okay.
Well,
Excellent.
thank you, everybody.
Thank
And
you.
we will see you next time. And I should.
Okay.
Alrighty, thank you.
Great. Thank
Of
you.
course. Yeah, of course.
Bye, everybody.
Yes. Yeah.